Somewhere on your street, there is a fence that stops people in their tracks every June. Saucer-sized purple flowers, dozens of them, spilling over the top like something out of a postcard. And one summer you decided, I want that. So you drove to the garden center, found the vine with the photo on the tag, paid your $15, maybe $20, and carried it home like a small promise. You planted it. You watered it. You did everything they told you. And then one morning in July, you walked out with your coffee, and it was black. The whole vine collapsed overnight, like someone had been at it with a torch. I know that morning. I have heard about it from more gardeners than I can count. Folks who have been growing things their whole lives, who know their own soil by the feel of it, and nearly every one of them has that same story. And do you know what they were told afterward? Clematis is just finicky. Some folks have a black thumb. Better luck next year. I want to say this plainly, because somebody should have said it to you a long time ago. Your clematis did not die because of anything wrong with your hands. It died because the advice came up short from the very first day. The tag on that pot never told you how deep to set the plant. It never mentioned that clematis comes in 3 kinds, pruned 3 different ways. It said nothing at all about the wilt. And the feeding instructions on the bag you bought next, those are very likely the reason that, the year before, the same vine handed you a wall of leaves and almost no flowers at all. Today, I want to give you 8 things, 8 quiet corrections that the people selling these vines have little reason to teach you. Not because anyone is hiding them in a vault, nobody is. Simply because not one of them can be poured into a bottle and sold back to you every spring. And stay with me to the 3rd one, the part about pruning, because that single misunderstanding throws away more clematis flowers in this country than wilt and bad weather put together. Think back to the last thing you planted out of a nursery pot. You dug a hole about as deep as the container, set the plant in so the soil line matched, firmed it, and watered it. And for almost everything in the garden, that is exactly right. Clematis is the great exception. And if you have grown tomatoes for any length of time, you already understand the idea in your bones. You can bury a tomato halfway up its stem, and it will root all along that buried section and grow the stronger for it. Clematis does something close to that, and it is one of the best-kept practical secrets in all of ornamental gardening. When you set a clematis, you do not match the soil line. You plant the crown, that point where the roots meet the stems, 2 to 3 inches below the surface. You are deliberately burying the first set of leaf nodes, those little swollen joints where the leaves come off the stem. Here is why that one strange step matters more than anything else you will do for this plant. Those buried nodes become an insurance policy underground. If a late frost burns off the top, if a mower clips the base, if a rabbit decides your vine is breakfast, or if the wilt takes the whole top in a single night, the plant is not gone. Those nodes sit safe below the soil, insulated, holding buds in reserve, and in their own time they push up brand new shoots and rebuild the entire vine from the ground up. That is the whole difference between a plant that dies on you and a plant that simply starts again. Now, here is the honest part the tag will never sort out for you, and where even a lot of good advice gets it half wrong. This deep planting is a gift for the big summer hybrids, the ones you see most often. Your Jack Manii, your Nellie Moser, the president. Plant those deep, every time. But the evergreen clematis, the ones that hold their leaves all winter like Armandii, do not want this at all. Bury their crowns and they tend to rot, so you set those at pot level, no deeper. And the one that surprises people, the vigorous spring Montana, early blooming as it is tough enough to be planted deep right alongside the summer hybrids. So the simple rule to carry out to the garden is this. Large flowered and Montana go deep. Evergreen stays level. As for the hole itself, dig it a good foot across and a foot down, loosen the bottom, and work in a generous handful or 2 of compost. That compost is not a quick feed. It is food for the soil life that will, in turn, look after your plant. And that idea is going to come back more than once today. Set the crown 2 to 3 inches low, backfill, firm out the air pockets, and water it in deeply. That is the whole thing. One extra step. The most protective 2 inches in the clematis world. There is an old saying among clematis growers, passed down for generations, cold feet, warm face. It sounds like a riddle, but it holds a real truth about this plant. and one small piece of it deserves a closer, more honest look than it usually gets. The warm face is the simple half. Clematis is a sun lover. The top of the plant, the stems, the leaves, the flowers, wants a good 6 hours of direct sun a day to bloom well. Give the big hybrids closer to 8, and many will thank you with still more flowers. Plant one in afternoon shade against a north wall, and you will get a polite amount of green and very few blooms, so face to the sun. That part is not in dispute. The feet are where it gets interesting. The roots want the opposite of the flowers. They like to stay cool and evenly moist, never bake dry. When the soil at the base turns hot and dusty in high summer, the plant feels it. It sheds leaves, it drops buds, and in a bad spell it can shut down early. All that lovely sun-fed growth up top gets quietly undercut by a root zone that is simply too hot. Now, the traditional fix you will read everywhere is to crowd plants around the base, or to lay a big flat stone over the roots, to keep them shaded. And here is where I want to be straight with you, because the honest answer is more useful than the tidy one. That advice is genuinely debated among experienced growers. Robert Pavlis, the gardener and author behind the long-running Garden Myths project, has made the case that clematis roots do not actually need to be any cooler than the roots of your other perennials, and that crowding greedy companions right against the crown can keep it too wet and even invite the very wilt we are trying to avoid. A heavy stone, for its part, can soak up the day's heat and hold it against the soil all night, doing the opposite of what you hoped. So what is the move that both camps can agree on? Mulch, a 2 to 3 inch layer of shredded bark, wood chips, or straw, spread around the base and kept a few inches back from the stem so it never traps rot. It keeps the soil cooler in summer and evenly moist between rains, it smothers weeds, and as it breaks down, it feeds the soil life underneath. If you would like a low, shallow-rooted plant nearby for the look of it, that is fine. Just give the crown its own breathing room. But the mulch is the part that does the real work. Cool, steady soil, built by feeding the ground rather than fussing over it. That is what your clematis is actually asking for. Here is the one I promised you. If there is a single piece of clematis knowledge that separates the gardener who gets flowers from the gardener who gets a healthy green disappointment, this is it. And almost nobody hears it in plain words, so let me give it to you in plain words. Every clematis belongs to one of 3 pruning groups. These are not fussy categories somebody invented to fill a book. They describe a real difference in when and where each vine makes its flower buds. Cut at the wrong time, in the wrong way, and you are not tidying the plant. You are snipping off every flower it had been quietly preparing all year. The vine grows back lush and leafy and gives you nothing. That is never a black thumb. That is a calendar mistake. Let me walk you through all 3, slowly, because this is the part worth acting on. Group 1 are the early birds. They flower in late winter or spring, on what growers call old wood, stems that grew the summer before and have been holding their buds through the cold, waiting. Cut those stems back in late winter to neaten things up, and you have just thrown next spring's flowers on the compost heap. So Group 1 asks almost nothing of you, a light tidy right after it finishes blooming, taking out only what is dead or in the way. That is the whole job. This group includes the fragrant Montana, the evergreen Armandii, and the nodding Alpina types. Group 2 are the repeat performers, the big, dinner plate hybrids that fill the garden center benches. Names like Nellie Moser, the President, Duchess of Edinburgh. These bloom twice, first in late spring on last year's wood, then again in late summer on this year's new growth. Because they flower on both, your hand has to be gentle. In late winter, you only edit. Take out the dead and the weak, spindly bits, and leave as much healthy old wood as you can, because that old wood is carrying your first big flush. No hard chop. Group 3 are the easiest of all, and a lot of folks find them the most satisfying. These bloom in mid to late summer on brand new growth only. They carry nothing on old wood, so every late winter, you simply cut the whole plant down hard, to about 12 inches above the ground, every stem. Then you step back and let it run. It throws up vigorous new shoots, and those shoots are your flowers. That yearly haircut is exactly what keeps these from turning into a tangled bird's nest of bare, woody stems. This group includes the famous Jackmanii and the tough, wilt-resistant Viticellas. Now, the most useful thing in this whole section, so stay with me. What if you lost the tag and you have no earthly idea which group you own. Then do nothing. For 1 full year, set the shears down and simply watch. Does it bloom in April? Group 1. Does it give you big flowers in May and then more in August? Group 2. Does it wait until high summer to explode? Group 3. 1 season of patience, and you will know that plant for the rest of its life, and you will never cut it wrong again. And if you have a clematis that has slowly stopped flowering over 3 or 4 years, this is almost always the reason. You have been cutting a Group 1 in winter, or hard pruning a Group 2 and losing its first flush, or leaving a Group 3 uncut until it choked on its own old wood. The fix is the same in every case. Name the group, prune it right for a couple of seasons, and the flowers nearly always come home. Nothing exotic, just the right cut at the right time. There may be nothing in the whole garden as heartbreaking as Clematis wilt. A vine that looked magnificent on Tuesday, full, lush, loaded with buds, and by Wednesday morning, the entire top has collapsed. Stems gone black, leaves hanging like wet newspaper, the whole thing looking like it has been dead a week. It happens that fast, and it is gutting. And so most people do the logical thing. They decide the plant is finished, they dig it out, they bin it, they drive back to the garden center, and they replant in the same spot the same way. And then they wonder why it happens all over again. So let me tell you what wilt actually is, because understanding it changes everything. The wilt is caused by a soil-borne fungus. The Royal Horticultural Society, which has tracked this disease for decades, gives it the name Caliphoma clematidina. Its spores splash up from the soil and infect the plant through the leaves and the soft young stems, and the infection runs down into the stem and blackens it at or near ground level. That blackened stem can no longer carry water, so everything above it collapses. And here is the part worth holding on to. That dramatic overnight death is the top of the plant being cut off from its roots. In most cases, not every case, but most, the roots themselves are untouched and very much alive. And now you see why Secret One comes back to save you here. If you planted that crown 2 to 3 inches deep, you have living buds sitting below the soil that the fungus struggles to reach. The top can die completely, while the plant below ground is still holding its reserves. So here is exactly what you do, and it is not complicated. First, do not panic. Second, take clean shears and cut the entire collapsed vine right down to the ground, just above the soil. Third, and this one matters, gather up every black, limp piece and put it in the bin, or burn it. Do not compost it. A home compost heap does not get hot enough to kill those spores, and composting the debris is how you spread the trouble across your whole garden. Fourth, lay a little fresh compost around the base, water it in, and keep that soil cool and evenly moist. Then, fifth, and this is the hardest part, you wait. In most cases, within 2 to 4 weeks, you will see them. Small, clean, bright green shoots pushing up from the soil where you were sure the plant had died. That is the vine rebuilding itself from those protected underground buds. It was never dead, it simply reset. I have watched that quiet resurrection more times than I can tell you, and it never stops being a small wonder. A few honest words on keeping it from happening at all. The fungus likes to get in through wounds, so handle those brittle stems gently as you tie them in. Good airflow helps, so do not jam the plant flat against a wall with no breeze. Watering at the base rather than over the leaves keeps the top drier, and if you have fought wilt in the same spot year after year, lean on the Viticella group. Those tougher, small-flowered Group 3 vines are widely regarded as among the most wilt-resistant you can grow. Here is a mistake I see constantly, and the kindest thing about it is that it comes from love. You want your vine to thrive. So you reach for a bag of fertilizer, you read that Clematis is a hungry plant, and you feed it, often with a high nitrogen, all-purpose feed, regularly, all season long. And what you get is spectacular. A great, lush, towering wall of green leaves and almost no flowers. Let me tell you plainly what is happening, because this is the heart of everything this channel believes. Nitrogen, the first number on the bag, drives leafy growth. It is the gas pedal for green, and it does that job beautifully. But a plant, being pushed hard on nitrogen, has no reason in the world to flower. It is far too busy making leaves. Flood it with nitrogen, and you get exactly what you fed it. Now here is where I have to be honest with you. because this is the part that even good gardeners and plenty of videos get wrong. The usual advice at this point is to rush out and buy a bloom booster, a fertilizer high in phosphorus, that middle number on the bag, on the promise that phosphorus makes flowers. It mostly does not. Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott, the extension horticulturist at Washington State University, who has spent her career separating garden folklore from what the evidence actually shows, has been clear about this. Most garden soils already hold plenty of phosphorus, and piling on more does not buy you more blooms. Worse, an excess can lock up other nutrients the plant needs, and it interferes with the very soil fungi, the mycorrhizae, that help your plant feed itself. Pour on phosphorus, and you can quietly work against the living soil you are trying to build. So if the answer is not a magic flowering powder, what is it? It is the thing this whole channel comes back to. Feed the soil, and let the soil feed the plant. In early spring, as the first new growth appears, work a generous handful or two of good compost or well-rotted manure gently into the surface of the soil around the base, a foot out in every direction, never piled against the stem. That gives the plant a slow, balanced living source of everything it needs, and it feeds the soil community that does the real work. That is your foundation. No bag required. If you want to give the flowers a nudge as bloom time comes on, there is one feed that genuinely earns its place, and it earns it through potassium, that third number on the bag, not phosphorus. Potassium supports strong cell walls, disease resistance, and good flowering and color. A high potash tomato or rose feed, used as the buds are forming and again lightly after the first flush fades, is the time-honored Clematis booster, and it works for the right reason. Lean toward the lower end of the dose. This plant does not need to be force-fed, and one firm line, whatever you feed, stop by early summer. A late feed pushes out soft new growth with no time to harden before frost, and that tender growth becomes a liability when the cold comes. Feed the soil in spring, nudge with potash at bloom time, then let the plant wind down on its own. Steady soil and a little restraint will carry a clematis through seasons of the kind of weather that flattens a force-fed vine. Before we go on to the second half, and there are 3 more secrets coming, including the one small rule that decides whether your vine ever climbs at all, I want to give you something. Everything we have covered so far, the planting depth, the 3 pruning groups laid out on one simple chart, the wilt rescue step-by-step, the honest feeding plan. I have gathered it all onto a single page you can print and tape inside the shed door, or tuck into your garden notebook. Point your phone at the code on the screen, and it is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then stay with me, because the next secret is the one that quietly decides whether all your good work ever makes it up the trellis. Have you ever watched a clematis flop over, tangle into a knot at the bottom, and flatly refuse to climb the beautiful trellis you bought for it? It is easy to blame the plant. The plant is not the problem. The trellis is. Most vines climb in one of a few ways. Ivy glues itself on with little pads. Sweet peas reach out with grasping tendrils. Clematis does neither. It climbs by wrapping its leaf stems, the slender stalks that hold each leaf, around a support. And here is the catch that almost no trellis on a store shelf accounts for. Those leaf stems are short. They can only wrap around something thinner than about ½ inch across. Thinner still, a ¼ inch, is better yet. So when you stand a clematis against a chunky wooden trellis with wide slats, or a broad fence rail, the poor thing simply cannot get a grip. It reaches, finds nothing it can hold, slides back down, and collapses under its own weight. And a stem that snaps in the wind is not just a lost stem, remember secret 4, it is an open wound for the wilt fungus to walk right into. The climbing problem and the disease problem turn out to be the same problem. The fix costs almost nothing, which is rather the theme of this whole garden. You do not have to throw out a handsome trellis, run some plain twine, fishing line, or a length of garden wire across it, or staple a panel of wire mesh behind it. Anything that gives those leaf stems something thin to grab. The vine will take hold of the near invisible line and scramble straight to the top, and you will look like you have a magic touch, for the price of a spool of string. One more small thing. Set the trellis a couple of inches off the wall, so air can move behind the leaves. That airflow is one more quiet guard against disease. Most gardeners do not know this is even possible, so let me hand it to you. Many of the big Group 2 hybrids can be coaxed into blooming a second time in a single season. Not one flush of flowers, two. It comes down to what you do the moment that first flush begins to fade. When a clematis flower is spent, the plant's next instinct is to pour its energy into making a seed head. Those fluffy, silvery puffs you see later in the year. They are lovely in their own right, but making them costs the plant a great deal of energy. So we gently step in before that happens. The moment those first blooms start to tire and drop their petals, you deadhead, and you do it properly, not by pinching the flower off at its neck. Follow the spent stem down 12 to 18 inches until you find a strong, healthy pair of leaves with a plump bud sitting in the joint where leaf meets stem. Cut cleanly, just above that bud. By cutting there, you turn the plant away from making seed and back toward making flowers, into those waiting buds. Give it a good drink, and that same light feed of high-potash tomato or rose food we talked about. And then comes the hard part, patience. In about 6 to 8 weeks, usually by late summer, those buds open into a whole second show. The flowers may come a touch smaller than the first round. That is completely normal, but they arrive just as much of the garden is winding down, so they carry the day all the same. It is a quiet bit of teamwork between you and the plant, and the reward is a fence in flower from spring clear into fall. Our last secret is about the body of this plant, and learning to work with it rather than against it. A clematis root system is unusual, where many perennials have fine, forgiving, fibrous roots that shrug off being moved. Clematis roots are thick, long, and wiry. Because of that, they take physical damage hard, and they deeply resent being dug up and transplanted. So if you lift an established clematis to move it to a better spot, you are very likely to send it into a serious sulk, and you may lose it altogether. The lesson is a gentle one. Get the spot right the first time. Before you ever dig, think it through. Where will it climb? How much sun does that wall get through the day? Is it within reach of a hose on a hot August evening? Choose well once, and you will never have to put the plant through a move it cannot forgive. The stems ask for the same gentleness. Clematis stems are brittle. The young green ones snap easily, and even the older, woody-looking ones will crack if you try to bend them where they do not want to go. So when the vine comes on strong in late spring, give it 5 minutes a week. Tuck the new stems toward the trellis and tie them loosely with soft twine, or even an old strip of cloth. Loose, never tight, so you never strangle a stem as it thickens. You are not wrestling this plant into place. You are just offering a hand. A little gentle guidance early keeps the stems from whipping and cracking in the wind, keeps that wilt door shut, and builds, season by season, a sound and magnificent living wall of flowers. Think back to that fence at the start, the one down the street, dripping with flowers, the one you wanted so badly. I will tell you something. The first clematis I ever truly loved was not mine. It was my grandmother's, on a tired wooden fence behind her house, and every June it did exactly that, stopped you in your tracks. For years I assumed she had some gift I did not, that she simply knew how to make things bloom. It took me far too long to understand that she was not doing anything magic at all. She had set it deep, in ground she had fed for years, with whatever the kitchen and the garden gave back. She had never once reached for a bottle. She just understood the soil, and she let the soil do the rest. None of what I have given you today is complicated, and not one bit of it asks for a special trip or an expensive bag. Plant it deep, and give it a life underground. Keep its feet cool with mulch, and feed the ground, not the leaves. Learn its 3 simple ways with the shears. Do not lose heart when the wilt comes. Cut it down, and wait for the green to return. Give those leaf stems something thin to hold, and settle the plant into one good home, gently, for good. If you are in your gardening years, if you have already replaced enough plants that should have lived, you have earned a vine that comes back stronger every spring and covers your world in color without asking for your every waking hour. Grown this way, a clematis is exactly that plant. And if that is the kind of gardening you come from, or the kind you would like to grow into, then you already belong here. This is a place for people who would rather feed the soil than chase the next miracle on a shelf. Subscribe, and let us keep tending the old, honest way, together. I will see you out in the garden.